Southeast Asia program, filling the shoes of Dr. Richard Cronin, who's a co-author of our report, who retired in June, or retired to a new position of Senior Distinguished Fellow. And I'm here with my co-author, Courtney Weatherby, and of this publication, our latest in the letters from the Mekong, a call for strategic basin-wide energy planning in Laos. And joining us also is Ana Maria Quintero from the Nature Conservancy, who will talk about some of the services or approaches to a better plan for energy planning in Laos. We're going to start with a little bit of an intro to the Mekong system. Mekong is known for its fish. The Mekong River is one of the most biodiverse fisheries in the world. There are more species of migratory fish in this river than any other river, and it's only second to the Amazon in terms of total biodiversity. And millions, tens of millions of people in the countries that the Mekong flows through, China, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and bordering Myanmar as well, depend on the freshwater catches, the wild catches from this river. If we look at what comes out of this river, the Mekong is the world's largest inland fishery. Compared to any other country in the world, the Mekong beats them by far. So France is kind of large with 450,000 tons of fresh wild-caught fish coming out of its rivers each year. Uganda, somewhat similar. The 2.8 million tons on that chart there is now what most scientists and experts use, because this is what has been drawn from evidence talking to the actual fishermen who consume the fish and sell it at the market. So by far, the Mekong River is the world's largest inland fishery. Dams stop those fish flows. Dams will bring a critical challenge to the flow of those fish through the region, regardless of the type of mitigation efforts that are put on into these dams, fish passages, or the Saibai Dam here, the big one on the Mekong going up right now on the Mekong mainstream, has really interesting technology. It's got a fish elevator, there are long fish passages, resting pools for the fish, and another way for the fish to get upstream by swimming through the navigation locks. So a lot of $500 million worth of mitigation effort has been put into this. Will it work? We don't know. These large dams like the Saibai Dam and the Don Sahong Dam gain a lot of attention in the media. This is the site of the future Pek Beng Dam in Laos. It's upstream from Luang Prabang. If any of you have ever taken the boat from the Golden Triangle in Thailand or Laos down the river to Luang Prabang, you would pass through Pek Beng and stay there overnight. This is where the next big dam on the Mekong is going up, and construction should begin within the next couple months. We're waiting for the Mekong River Commission to be notified by Laos so that the prior notification procedures are started as mandated by the Mekong Agreement. And that's a system that brings the countries together to discuss reactions to this particular project, and we can get into some of those details later. But this will be a dam that gains a lot of bandwidth in the media once it begins, whether it's in the region or from the global media. But one of the messages that we want to get out today is that these large dams on the mainstream are only part of the picture, and they focus our attention too narrowly on some of the bigger projects, when what is really going on is a very large plan for damming within the entirety of the Mekong Basin in Laos. There are tributary dams going up, like this one on the Nam U River, north of Luang Prabang, this one on the Nam Khan River, east of Luang Prabang, and 100 total dams for the country of Laos. And Laos is betting its future on the export of power to the region for its economic development as its number one priority. So what we're going to do today is talk about, is this a feasible plan? Our answer is no. And we've discovered that because of the way the system is set up for damming the river, Laos has no strategic plan to build these dams in terms of consideration of optimization of power resources, in terms of coordinating between projects, and very importantly in terms of being able to make balance or strike a balance between the energy that is generated from these dams and then the impacts to core environmental flows like fish and sediment. So today we're going to start, Courtney and I are going to do a tag team a little bit back and forth to go over some of the main points of our publication. She will talk about kind of some trends that are driving the unsustainable and unknown future of damming in the Mekong. And then I will get back to what a strategic basin-wide energy plan might look like and some of the risks that should be considered when going about that plan, and talk about a national power grid, which is an option for getting Laos in a better direction towards a strategic energy plan. And Courtney's going to talk a little bit about the regional energy demand in the future, and is Laos building too many dams? And then we're going to turn it over to Anna Maria, who will talk about a way that Laos could move forward. So I'm going to turn it to Courtney now. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. So I guess kicking off, I'll talk very, very briefly about the new narrative, which came out last year. It was our last major report in the Letters from the Mekong series, and it highlighted a number of political and financial risks for projects, specifically looking at the widespread impacts of civil society on driving the discussion about hydropower in the region and really framing it as a problem instead of just a benefit, which is the way that the government of Laos in particular has tried to frame the problem. Looking at the impacts from the technical review of the Mekong River Commission, which did make specific suggestions for the Seaburi project and the Don Sahong project, some of which were implemented, not to the extent that civil society might have liked to see, but as Brian mentioned earlier, Seaburi in particular spent between $200 and $500 million on additional fisheries research and redesign of the mitigation efforts after they received criticisms, and just the broader context of risk impacting the behavior of dam developers. So that was in our last report. Moving forward, what we really want to highlight are 4 trends that we've seen emerging in the years since that report. And the first of which is still an ongoing issue, and it is the 2015-2016 drought that occurred throughout the Mekong region. It is the most severe drought in 90 years of recording. In Cambodia, you've seen this picture is, in Vietnam, you've seen significant problems for the rice paddies. The delta in Vietnam is one of the most productive areas for agriculture. It is the rice basket of Vietnam, and it produces more than 50% of Vietnam's rice output and 90% of Vietnam's rice exports. So it is actually a pretty significant economic concern for Vietnam when they're not getting enough water to prevent salinization of the delta. And just this year alone, about half of the paddy in those rice fields was affected by drought this year. This drought is caused mainly by the El Nino impacts on the region, but it gives a taste of what we're looking to see in the future as climate change impacts the likelihood and increases the likelihood of droughts and flooding and just the intensity of these type of weather events overall. So Cambodia was also affected. Their rice output dropped about 7% this last year. And most importantly, Thailand was affected in the northeast region, and used this as an excuse to start diverting water for some of the Mekong tributaries. They've done it before on a small scale. They're announcing plans in the future to help avoid problems with water management during times of drought, to bring significant amounts of water out of the tributaries and into Thailand to support irrigation. And the biggest thing that emerged from that conversation is that they announced they're not going to bring this project before the Mekong River Commission, which in the past has been sort of the arbiter, if you will, for discussions about the major hydropower projects on the mainstream of the Mekong. Thailand has said that it is just a water diversion, it's not a dam, and it's not on the mainstream, so they're not going to bring this up for discussion, and they're going to move ahead. It's not all that dissimilar to what we saw from Laos. So what we're really seeing here is that the water scarcity emerging during drought is going to become a source of tension for the region. We've seen concerns in Cambodia and Vietnam in particular over the diversions because of the concerns over agriculture. Depending on where they're diverting water from, it could impact some of the operations of dams in Laos. So this management issue has really been brought into the forefront of the conversation. Mostly as attention. There was one potential bright spot, which was that during the drought, Vietnam raised its concerns to China upstream, and China did release water from the Jinghong Dam in an effort to help address some of the drought concerns. The amount that they could release was limited, but it's one of the few times that we've seen a positive response from China when they're getting asked about water sharing, water data, or anything in that field downstream. So essentially the drought has really brought this into the mainstream of political discourse in the region over cooperation and competition. The second major factor that we've seen in the last year are the impacts of the economic slowdown in China. Previously, China, and this is important because China is the largest builder of dams globally. They've built more than 50% of the large dams around the world, and they are, of course, building dams on their part of the Mekong called the Lansang in Yunnan province, as well as funding a number of the dams, both on the Mekong mainstream and on the tributaries, in particular in Laos. So the economic slowdown in China is significant because in the past, many of these projects, when the MOUs were signed, China was having double-digit economic growth. Even in the recent years, as it started to slow down after the 2008 recession, China's growth is still estimated around 7%, 6.5%. What we're seeing now is that it's likely, outside analysts are saying, the statistics that they're giving out are still saying around 6%. They're aiming for 6.5%. It's really more like 4.5%. And at the same time that China's economy is slowing down, we're seeing significant increase in debt. There are 18 consecutive months in recent years of slow but steady rise in just recognized bad debt in China.
Let's go to the slide and check that out.
So Brian pulled some from an economist article on this. But essentially, many of the bad debt projects are projects that were given to big SOEs with a lot of influence. They had a lot of loans. They were able to guarantee these projects. And a number of them were projects in the hydropower, mining, or other strategic sectors. So some of them fell under what you could be considered policy loans, where China had an interest in investing in strategic sectors abroad. So they would support loans that were potentially risky, but during a time of high growth, that was viewed as acceptable. As the economic slowdown continues, risk is becoming more of a concern, both for the SOEs that have a lot of projects on their balance sheet and have a lot of debt already, but equally so for the financial institutions that are now concerned that they're not going to be able to make some of the money back from these projects. And in cases of hydropower dams in particular, the risk with these projects is that they do require significant amounts of money upfront, and then the profit margins are made up over a long term. Many of the projects in the Mekong region, for instance, are, if it's a Chinese funder, they're funding a Chinese developer to build it. Usually the developer will build, own, and operate the project for up to 30 years and then transfer it over to local ownership after they've had a chance to make up the money and then make a profit margin for maybe a decade. So it requires long-term efficient operation of these projects in order to make the money back and pay off the loans. So that's a concern for a lot of these projects. And anecdotally, we're already seeing evidence that this is preventing some projects from moving forward. An instance in Myanmar is after the Myat Son Dam, which was a large dam, was suspended a few years ago over political pushback. And the president just announced that they were going to suspend the project until the new administration. That was only one of 7 projects that were on the Irrawaddy River in Myanmar. The other 6 were going to be made by the same developer, and they were also going to receive funding from a consortium of Chinese banks, including the Export-Import Bank. And since that project is still stuck in limbo, then the Exim Bank has actually said that they're not going to disperse money for the additional projects until the political issues over the Myat Son are addressed. So they're seeing issues there, they're seeing risk there, and similarly in Laos, we heard anecdotal evidence from a couple hydropower developers at a conference last year that there are a number of smaller projects on the tributaries that they had MOUs signed, they had potential financing lined up, but they're holding off on construction because they're actually not sure that these projects are going to be profitable, and the banks are giving some pushback now. So that's a concern moving forward for anyone who's looking to develop projects in Laos. And the other 2 more regional contextual factors are the rise of Myanmar, which in recent years, because of the political transition that it's undergone, is now more open for business than it has been in the past. So previously, MOUs were largely just signed with Thai and Chinese companies. They were often done sort of behind the scenes under the aegis of the military. Those projects are now potentially open for investment from other arenas, and Myanmar's new government is trying to take a more strategic approach to development in the region. So they're working with international institutions such as IFC on a strategic environmental impact assessment and essentially planning strategically to make sure that all of their projects moving forward are going to be viable and that they can coordinate them with one another. That's just a sign of interest. We're seeing a lot of Thai companies, especially moving in and taking over projects that previously had been potentially joint, or that had been Chinese projects and are now going to potentially be joint projects with Thailand to sell abroad. And the only point there is that Myanmar has potential significantly higher for hydropower than Laos does. Many of these projects might be more viable than some of the smaller projects in Laos, but they were essentially off. They were just not a choice. They were not on the table for any international institutions that were looking to fund hydropower projects. So there is the likelihood that as Myanmar comes online, as they improve their governance standards, they've come out with EIA procedures this year, that some of those projects may be competitive with Laos for funding that was not already agreed upon. And then the fourth is the rise of environmental pressures and standards in the region. Cambodia in particular, after the election in 2013, where the opposition in what many considered to be a rigged election still made significant gains, Hun Sen and his party in power decided that they were going to strategically try to address, even if it was burnishing the credentials, but they wanted to address some of the main concerns, which were corruption, land grabbing, and the unsustainable development, many of the benefits of which were seen to flow specifically towards the elites. And one of the ways that they're doing this is revising their environmental impact assessments. And from what we've seen, this process has actually been relatively high in standards. They've done consultation with outside organizations, with NGOs, and with some civil society groups. They have included the potential for a transboundary impact assessment, which is new. That's something that many environmental groups have been advocating for the region, particularly in the context of hydropower dams, to do a cumulative and a transboundary impact assessment for these projects. Cambodia has actually included that in their new EIA plan. And they're also looking at implementing a broader environmental code, which the aim of which is to streamline the implementation of enforcement of these projects. Currently, you've got a number of different line agencies and ministries that are involved. Sometimes there are overlapping responsibilities, and they can essentially bounce the ball back and forth over whether, doing a strong EAA or something, or other environmental concerns, whose responsibility it was, who has to monitor, who has to enforce it. They're looking to streamline all of that and put a lot of these responsibilities specifically under the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment.
Courtney, can I ask who's leading the way in Cambodia?
Yes, so the new Minister of Environment for Cambodia, his name is Sai Samal. He was trained abroad. He had a background in fisheries research, and he'd trained, I believe it was in Australia. But he's also the son of a high-level CPP member. And so he actually has backing from Hun Sen to go in and really streamline some of these processes, because they want to really burnish their credentials. They see this as one of the main reasons that they lost a lot of votes in the 2013 election, and the public pressure was enough that they decided that they needed to start transitioning into a more modern and sustainable code on these issues. And so he's gone in and he's done a lot of this work with the support from Hun Sen directly. So that's kind of an important contextual comparison, because Cambodia is also the other lower Mekong country that is looking to move forward on mainstream hydropower projects. Of the 11 proposed projects in the lower Mekong, 9 of them are in Laos, but 2 of them are in Cambodia. And Cambodia is also building a number of tributary dams as well, so it's potentially the closest comparison for Laos. Similarly, we've seen in Myanmar, under the new regime in particular, movement forward on environmental laws. They've been going through this similar debate that we've seen in Laos over how to best balance the need for development, because similarly, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, these are all least developed countries. The living standards are fairly low. There's a lot of opportunity for growth, and so decision makers are looking to balance bringing in investment for projects and addressing the concerns of the local communities and civil society. And in Myanmar and Cambodia, this is potentially also clearly due to the fact that they are nominally democracies. So you have opposition parties that can take up issues over environmental problems and bring it into the political arena. That's not the case for Laos, but we have seen emerging signs that this is on the radar of the elite decision makers, because they have, for instance, a National Assembly hotline where people who have concerns over a project can anonymously call and complain to their National Assembly members. And
we do want to say that there's no whistleblower protection.
Yeah, there's no
Laos,
whistleblower protection there, so there's concern. It is anonymous, the hotline is anonymous, so depending on how closely they're tracking, it might be hard for them to find who's calling if there are a number of people calling and leaving anonymous complaints. But what we've seen is that this is reflected in local communities and interviews that we've done. People are aware of this, they're interested in using it, and they are very willing, if people that they have elected locally do not listen to their complaints, to vote against them in the next election. So despite the fact that civil society in Laos is very controlled, there are quiet methods and subtle ways of getting these concerns into the policymaking community. And at the same time, Laos underwent a leadership transition in early 2016, and a number of the officials that were seen as most pro-development projects, particularly Chinese development projects, a number of them were sort of retired from office. And one of the people that got a promotion was someone who is known for responding to complaints through the national hotline. So there are some indications that there's awareness of these problems in Laos. So essentially, that's just sort of the final factor there. It is obviously limited because of the authoritarian regime in Laos, but at the same time, there's potential progress there, and there is growing awareness of the problems. And just on that note as well, these are very porous borders, and while the living standards in Laos are relatively low, people hear about what happens in the neighboring countries. So if they hear that, for instance, protests in Myanmar and Cambodia were able to push for the suspension of the Miet Son and the Orang Dam, people hear about that. If there are protests elsewhere in Laos, even if they're cracked down on, people hear about that. We did hear references to other protests in other areas of the country when we've done interviews with people before, so those things are on their radar. So there are opportunities for this to impact future decisions on projects.
Thanks. Can I drive?
I will. Click it back over.
Thanks. So these are some of the factors that are spelling uncertainty for the future of the basin. And we'll go back to this map, which shows planned dams, dams under construction, and completed dams, not just on the mainstream, but on the tributaries. And again, there are more than 100 of them. Why Laos? Well, I think this map says a lot, that Laos is building more dams on the Mekong than any country. China is going to have 20 on the upstream of its portion of the Mekong. Cambodia is 10, 20 or so. And these dams will be much smaller than China's dams. I do want to say that China's dams are some of the biggest in the world. The amount of water that's held back by China's storage dams that are turned on when demand is high is more than the Chesapeake Bay, than all the water in the Chesapeake Bay. But Laos, with this plan, is just going to dam the river, and almost every aspect of it. And this map actually comes from studies that the U.S. did during the war in Indochina, the war in Vietnam, and then the secret war, so-called secret war in Laos, and then in Cambodia, when there was a plan that if the U.S. won and was able to control this region, the U.S. could build a similar Tennessee Valley Authority project in Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia, that would strike a balance between hydropower, irrigation needs, and flood control. Because this is a river that floods intensely during the monsoon season, and what happens upstream will impact the Mekong Delta downstream. There was a coordinated effort to manage the water's resources. That never came to fruition. The books were stored away for a while. Laos emerged back in the 1990s as a country that was beginning to get its economic reform efforts together, and I don't want to say they went and found the catalog, but after looking at the potential resources that could be derived from the river and the potential income gain as a way to stay in the game in the region, as a form of hard currency that can help finance its import and export of goods, trade, and then also give it kind of a reason for being within the region. At the center of it, these dams became very appealing. And the process was quite simple. Laos couldn't build them themselves, did not have the resources to finance a single one of these projects, so put the map up for sale. And the entire catalog was open for outside investors from Thailand, from China, from the World Bank, and other countries to build dams in Laos on what is known as the Build, Own, Operate, Transfer model, or the BOOT model. So each of these dams is a commercial opportunity project up for sale by foreign investors to come in and construct the dam. After a period and operate the dam and reap the profits from it, about maybe 12 years after the dam goes into operation, and then turn it over to the Lao government 25 to 30 years later. So at some point in time, 25 to 30 years from now or more, Lao will begin to own and take on the responsibility of operating and maintaining these dams. If we look at the current state of construction, we can see that it's still somewhat early days for Laos. This is combining all mainstream and tributary projects larger than 15 megawatts. There are 29 dams completed that only make up 15% of the total capacity. This should read percent of total capacity, not total dams. That's the amount of power that can be generated out of the entire basin. Around 2020, we'll reach less than 20%. So we're looking at this 2020 time, that now is a critical time to think about the future for the remaining 80%, or what the remainder might be for getting to Laos goals. And you can see that under a feasibility study, these are dams that either only have MOUs signed or they're very early in the preparatory process. These are projects that could be canceled. These are projects that could be repurposed, that could be recited, could be put in other parts of the basin that will not be so damaging to the critical environmental flows in the downstream countries within Laos. This system that the Lao government has set up, because they didn't have the resources to build it themselves, we can call it a project-by-project approach, rather than a system scale of learning how the system works together, thinking about the ultimate outcomes. This project-by-project approach is one where the Lao government is unable to, one, know what dam will come next. Okay? And is unable to know what is the relationship between future dams because, well, the future is unknown. It's a process that plays out over time. And as this process plays out, we feel the cumulative risks to these dams are on the rise. The risks to managing the dams, the risks to managing the environmental flows. More dams equate more risks for management. And it kind of makes sense for the export needs because Laos wants to go full steam ahead with these projects and export all of the power to the surrounding countries. It allows into renewable energy as well. And when we meet with officials at the Ministry of Energy and Mines, they're very enthusiastic about the future of energy in Laos. They're saying, we're going to do as much hydropower as we can, we're going to do as much renewables as we can. But that's not an approach. That's not an approach that lets you know, in the end, how much energy are you actually going to get out of the basin. It's not an approach that allows you to identify what are the red lines, what are the lines that can't be crossed for fisheries impacts that will impact the diets of people in Laos, for sediment distribution downstream to Vietnam and Cambodia and in Laos itself. There are too many unknowns with this process. And we think that there's a way to go about looking at the entire plan that will promote coordination between dams, that will promote optimization of power itself, not just hydropower in Laos, that will help the country reach its national development goals, and also that will help strike a balance between these critical environmental flows. And we think that plan can be done with fewer dams. One of those, I want to get to an anecdotal point. The future is unknown. There are 9 dams planned for the Mekong mainstream in Laos. And during conversations last year with some senior engineers at the Mekong River Commission, they said that, we think we're only going to get 5. And these were Lao nationals. Why? 4 of those dams are on the Thai-Lao border or very close to the border. So this would bring in the Thai legal process for approving the dam as well as the Lao legal process. So there are more challenges for these transboundary projects. So with 5 of 9, we get to about 60% of capacity. And going back to these unknowns, what can you think about the future of this basin? What proxies can we apply? What if this is the proxy? What if 60% is the final output for the entire basin? What if Laos, as the battery of Asia, only is able to generate 60% and generate the income from that 60%. What do you do with the 60% battery? We think one way forward is to complement that and reach that 100% goal with solar, wind, and other non-hydro energy resources. This is a way out. And this is something that Laos is exploring right now. But again, it's full steam ahead on both sides. We're looking for more of a balanced approach that helps Laos get to the end goal. Or there are other alternatives out there, ones that optimize revenue only, and then thinking about what are the methods to get to that revenue optimization. So that could mean fewer dams, less energy, and then more forms of economic development that will generate the income to assist Laos with its national development goals. And one way to get there is to improve transmission. Laos currently has no national power grid. So a central portion of our publication, and one that has been developed over the years by Dr. Richard Cronin, our former director and current senior distinguished fellow, is the national power grid and how that will benefit Laos as an anchor for supporting a shift to a strategic basin-wide energy plan. Currently, Laos has no national power grid. So this map shows some of the power distribution. It's a little bit old, but not much has occurred between 2013 and 2016 in terms of new power grid development. And Laos has 3 grids in the north that are connected, and then 1 in the south that is not connected. So its southern provinces are developing rapidly. They need power. They're importing it from Thailand, while the number 1 goal of economic development is to export power. And that's coming at a higher cost than the exported power because Laos is unable to negotiate prices with Thailand. It's more of a price taker than a price setter in the region. The distribution mechanism currently, if we think about, take a step back, if we think about power grids, these are typically public goods provided by a national government and that need to be there to help to assist these newer projects that are being built plug into a distribution system that will also not only benefit the export of power or the distribution of power, but benefit those projects themselves. Laos cannot afford, just like to build its dams, it cannot afford to build a national power grid. So the national power grid is being built out by the project developers themselves, by Thailand, by Chinese projects, and most of the larger projects are not connecting into the grid at all, or very minimally, or into these smaller grids, only in a minimal fashion. Most of them are taking 500 kilovolt lines from the dam, stretching it across the border to Thailand, that plug into a mall in Bangkok, if we can go there. There are new directives within Laos that will turn those lines inward to plug into these burgeoning grids. But again, it's being built at different standards. It's at the decision-making base of the developer itself, not the government of Laos, which needs to think about how this grid will be operated in the future. The benefits to a grid are many. We think that just with the existing projects planned for the tributaries, and by bringing in other forms of energy development such as solar and wind, Laos could forego the most damaging projects and still reach this export goal. Most of those damaging projects would be on the mainstream. So you could forego that just with the benefits that are provided by the national power grid.
I'll just note as well that concept of shifting some of those projects out in favor of upgrading existing dams, better integrating existing dams, and integrating renewables was not actually our idea originally. That was proposed by the Asian Development Bank in conversations that we had with them. Our concept originally had been to look more to regional power grid, and in conversations with ADB, they highlighted that actually improving Laos' internal grid was their number 1 priority for the country, and continues to be their number 1 priority for the country. And they highlighted that because of the ASEAN power grid build out and other lines that they're looking to build to Vietnam and upgrade to Cambodia as well, that if Laos had a national grid, that could essentially act as a regional grid for the mainland.
Right. It's a central core trunk that the rest of the grid runs through and is plugged into that would help facilitate kind of changes in demand throughout the region, provide more flexible distribution of power to, say, Thailand. If Thailand's demand decreases, Courtney's going to discuss this very briefly, or Vietnam's increases quickly due to rapid economic development there. Currently, there's very little of the Lao grid going into Vietnam. There are some obstacles related to environmental and social concerns that are keeping the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank from funding those connections. But it's up to the Lao government to ask for this project. So this is the #1 prioritized project for the ADB for Laos, but they can't move until Lao makes the move that we need this. And when we are in Laos talking to officials at the Ministry of Energy and Mines, it's a priority too, but they can't get around the sales process, right? They're too busy and occupied with the damming process itself to dedicate resources and capacity. The grid itself, again, and then I'll turn it over to Courtney to talk about regional power demand and whether Laos is building too many dams, is that this is a solution that can bring fewer dams into the entire basin and utilize other emerging technologies such as renewable non-hydro energy sources like solar and wind to help Laos reach those development goals.
Yes, so turning over to the energy demand side, as we discussed before, Thailand is the major player for purchasing electricity from Laos right now. They have the highest, from mainland Southeast Asia, they have the highest electricity use per person. Just for comparison purposes, Laos average per capita demand is about 500 kilowatt hours per year. Vietnam is about 1,300 kilowatt hours per year. Thailand is 2,500 and China is 3,700. And just for comparison, since most of us are used to living in the United States kilowatt hour per year usage is closer to like 13,000. So you can see that there's significant opportunity, for improvements in living standards, for electricity demand throughout the region as a whole. And within Laos, of course, that's even more significant than in Vietnam or Thailand, but the growth factors are just not there, and so the government has focused on exports instead of domestic development. Thailand is the largest purchaser, and part of that is their drive for diversification. Historically, Thailand's energy, 64% comes from natural gas, largely domestic reserves, which are starting to dry up, and some imported from Myanmar. So they're really looking to diversify their energy supply, and hydropower in Thailand is a little bit controversial. They have better environmental protections than the countries nearby and wider and more active civil society development. And so it's hard to do hydropower, or coal for that matter, within the borders of Thailand. So a lot of Thai companies have started investing in neighboring countries as an alternative. As far as the dams on the mainstream go, the Sheaburi Dam that Brian pointed to earlier is the first large Mekong mainstream dam, is almost entirely a Thai project. It's funded by Thai banks, it's built by a Thai construction company, and the power purchase agreement is this with the Electrical Generating Authority of Thailand. So Thailand is and plans to continue to be the main purchaser of power for Laos. And that's on the Laos side as well. Their plans looking in the future. Almost all of the high power transmission lines that they're looking to build, most of them are oriented towards Thailand rather than towards the other neighbors. However, there are a couple factors that might make Thailand's demands not what it is anticipated to be in the future. The first is that the Electrical Generating Authority of Thailand is both the planner as well as the purchaser of power, and they have a history of consistently overestimating electricity needs. Their reserve power right now is 39%, significantly higher. It's more than double the standard of 15% reserve power for a country. And even under their future power development plan, it's only anticipated to decrease to 20%, and that's of their current predictions. That's partly because EGAT has, the way that it's set up, they have a fixed rate of return for projects that they support, so there's incentives for overcapacity building in the electrical structure and power purchase agreements. The other factor here is that there's significant opportunity for energy efficiency improvements in Thailand. When you look at some of the studies, there have been a couple studies that bring up this particularly controversial point. Brian mentioned earlier that this power might be going to just a mall in Bangkok. There are independent malls in Bangkok that use more electricity than entire provinces in Bangkok and in Thailand in the less developed areas. And if you've ever had the chance to go to a mall in Thailand, you'll see that they have blasting air conditioning throughout the mall. They have the doors open. They're often air conditioning the building right in front because there's just there's no insulation. They don't try to keep the air conditioning. So it's just not been a priority in the past. And so many of the studies show that there's potential, depending on the scenario that you take, between 9 and 27% efficiency savings that can be brought in the future.
And just for a point of reference, the power that will be generated from the entire Mekong Basin satisfies
6 to 8% of the regional demand in the future. So if you build the 9 mainstream dams and some of the major tributary projects, that will only actually provide 6 or 8% of the needs in the region for all the significant impacts on fisheries, agriculture, and livelihoods. So the trade-offs there seem a little bit skewed. And in the case of Thailand, particularly, just that there is significant opportunity. We've seen signs that economic growth can decouple from energy use, and as that continues, it's very possible that in addition to the overestimation of capacity, Thailand just simply may improve efficiency and may not need all of the power that it's currently planning to buy from Laos.
And also, starting today, unfortunately, with the king's passing, this is just part of a cycle that will intensify now, we believe, of economic decline in Thailand, at least over the short term. And that will affect energy demand as well.
At least in the short term. So if Thailand is potentially not going to be as much a purchaser as Laos is currently planning on, what are the alternatives? Well, the other neighbors are Myanmar, Cambodia, and Vietnam. China is also, though they have in the past purchased some, but at the moment most of the electricity lines between Laos and China are actually importing electricity because the provinces on the border actually have a glut right now from domestic hydropower, so they don't need to buy energy from Laos. In the case of Myanmar, there are currently some sales right across the border in Shan State of Lao hydropower being sold into Myanmar. However, because of the new development opportunities and strategies in Myanmar and the overall potential that's far higher than Laos for hydropower and some other resources as well, it seems unlikely that this is going to be a long-term trend. The border regions may continue to buy low-level amounts of power from Laos, but Myanmar is not likely to be a significant energy market replacement for Thailand. Cambodia is in somewhat of a similar boat. They have, like Myanmar and Laos, a relatively low electrification rate of connections into a grid. They have similar low use per capita, so there's a lot of opportunity there, particularly with the industrial development that we're seeing in Cambodia. There is opportunity for a lot more electricity demand. They already import 37% of that electricity. Most of their electricity is imported through Thailand or Vietnam, and then the rest is largely made up through imported diesel fuels. So the prices in Cambodia are actually some of the highest in the region. As recently as 2012, urban residents were paying 25 cents a kilowatt hour. Rural residents in some cases were paying up to 80 cents a kilowatt hour because they just did not have access to reliable infrastructure and reliable energy. That has been improved somewhat in the recent years because a couple of hydropower projects came online and are providing a better baseload in Cambodia. But the price differential seems significant. Laos is selling its hydropower electricity at about 6 to 7 cents a kilowatt hour. So if you're paying 25 cents, there's a lot of opportunity there to save money. However, because they're already importing so much and already so dependent, Cambodia, just in our conversations with Cambodian energy planners, they're not interested in purchasing hydropower from Laos because it's seen as a national security issue with energy dependence on neighboring countries, which have in the past they've had occasional conflicts and disagreements with. So Cambodia is just not likely to become a major market for that reason, which leaves Vietnam, which is notable because Vietnam is one of the fastest growing countries in the region economically and energy demand-wise. Their energy demand over the last decade has been growing at 10 to 12% every year. It's projected to continue between 7 and 10% energy demand growth over the next decade through 2030. And it's notable that that's not including any benefits from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which if it goes through would likely support further industrialization in Vietnam. And it's also not accounting for the shift that we've seen in recent years of industry investments from China flowing down to Vietnam because of labor cost differences. As the labor cost in China has risen, there's sort of a China plus model that a lot of outside companies are now investing in Vietnam or Thailand. And so that could potentially add to growth, as well as just living standards. As I mentioned earlier, Vietnam's per capita energy use is really only about 1/3 that of China. So even for a developing country, there's a lot of unmet growth there, or an opportunity for unmet demand, rather. Vietnam's also going through a bit of a shift right now. Historically, they've been a primary exporter for electricity, mainly through coal. In 2015, they became a net importer, and in future, most of the coal that they're going to be using for their power plants is going to be imported. And that's notable because it's impacting prices. In the past, buying hydropower from Laos was considered economically inefficient because Vietnam's base load was mainly domestic hydropower, and that was selling around 4 or 5 cents a kilowatt hour. With Laos selling its electricity at 6 to 7 cents a kilowatt hour, it just wasn't seen as worth investing in the infrastructure or making the power purchase agreements there. With the import coal powering future plants, they're actually anticipating prices in Vietnam through 2020 to rise to something like 9 cents a kilowatt hour, which would make buying hydropower economically feasible. It would also make investing in solar economically feasible because solar in the region is a little over 7 cents a kilowatt hour. So both of those would potentially be good alternatives to building new power plants for coal. And so that's kind of one major factor here that's making Vietnam a likely future importer. And that was recently noted because Vietnam upped the number of, they have a power purchase agreement, or an MOU rather, with Laos to buy hydropower, and they actually upped the number from, I think, 2,000 to 3,000 or something like that. It was not a significant increase compared to the
Thailand,
overall demand that we're expecting to see. And compared to Thailand, still less than half of what Thailand is committed to buy in the near term. But given that Vietnam's expecting to see significant energy demand rise, there's clearly opportunity for that to grow. Most notably, however, Vietnam updated their power development plan last year, and they didn't take purchases from Lao Hydropower into account at all. When they're looking at what they're planning to do, coal is looking to increase from around 28% now to about 50% of Vietnam's electricity mix or energy mix. They did plan to import from Laos, but the import was only ever going to be something like 2.5% of their total energy demand, which was less than 1,000 megawatts. So that's not even matching the MOUs that they have. So there's clearly a little bit of a disconnect here with the role that imported hydropower or other resources like imported solar, if Laos is able to plug that into a grid, then those would both be economically feasible. That's not being taken into account in Vietnam. So moving forward, as we're envisioning the grid concept in Laos, it would make a lot of sense for Vietnam to start focusing as a potential purchaser. This would both make economic sense for Vietnam as well as potentially have positive benefits for climate change.
But that means more hydropower, right?
It doesn't necessarily mean more hydropower. Looking just at the economic side of it, I was talking about the hydropower selling for 6 to 7 cents, solar selling for a little over 7 cents. The price of solar per kilowatt hour has been dropping significantly in recent years. That's anticipated to continue through 2020 and possibly even 2030 as the price will continue to become more competitive. As we're seeing here, it's already going to be competitive versus the coal in Vietnam. And Laos has significant amounts of solar potential. It's an area, as Brian said, they're interested in going full steam ahead on hydro. They're also interested in going full steam ahead on other renewables. When we were speaking with the Institute of Renewable Energy within the Ministry of Mines in Laos, they have a lot of pilot projects moving ahead right now. The United States actually just announced a 20-megawatt solar power project earlier this year. There's a 600-megawatt Thai wind power plant that's being developed in southern Laos. At the moment, that's anticipated to be hooked back into the Thai grid, but if Laos had a grid that it could be hooked into, then these would actually be complementary to hydropower. And solar in particular, because hydropower, the way that it works during the dry season, it is not as efficient as it is during the wet season when they're constantly able to release, particularly in years of drought. So hydropower is a good base load for the region, but it could be offset by solar during the dry season when you're more likely to have clear skies. And they're looking at this. They are experimenting with actually solar plants being built on reservoirs in some areas so that they could have them connect directly into the grid build out that has already occurred. But it's not been a focus yet. And so there is opportunity for significant solar development in Laos and, of course, within Vietnam as well.
So then Vietnam could go in strategically to Laos, not just on a diplomatic level because the impacts will hurt Vietnam's economy, but with an economic leverage to say, let's go about planning these dams in a different way, or let's go about planning energy in a different way. So we feel that that's, and it's one of our recommendations in this report, for Vietnam to double down on its energy purchase from Laos. And one of the ways that the power could be rearranged, or dams could be rearranged to hit multiple objectives for flood control, for fish mitigation, for irrigation and power, comes from the Nature Conservancy through the Hydropower by Design approach. And if, Miles, we could switch to that presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Ana Maria to talk about Hydropower by Design.
Okay, thank you everybody, and thank you Courtney and Brian. That was a really good segue into what we're going to talk about, and you guys really touched upon some really important points of looking at hydropower development at the landscape scale instead of how it's normally been done on a project-to-project basis, and missing opportunities and not looking at the development opportunities for hydropower at the landscape scale. So what we're trying to do is deliver effective infrastructure development that benefits people and also the environment at a low cost. Here in this map, you can see that hydropower development will double in the next coming years by 2040. The blue areas are the existing dams, orange is under construction, and red is planned. And what this means is that in the next decade, in the next 35 years, hydro will double, and that's probably the same amount that's been built in the last 20th century. So you can also see the little red dots near in Southeast Asia and in the Mekong area there. This area, like Brian says, has very high species richness, but also really is experiencing a very high pressure for hydropower development and energy demand. So this comes at a cost to the people and to the environment. So the idea is to take these hydropower developments and elevate them to the landscape scale. How do these dams can work in conjunction with one another without interfering and creating the best outcomes for the basin? So our approach, our tool is called Hydropower by Design, and it does take all these elements, various metrics and elements at the basin level, from the economics, the environment, the social aspects, and like I said, elevates it to a broader scale and more of the development outcomes that a country would need. Not just in fragmentation or in barriers, but navigation control, and I'll get into those metrics in a little bit. So, like we said, a lot of these projects, most of these dams are built on a concession-to-concession basis, but it misses the range of opportunities and resources that can be seen at the landscape scale level. We want projects to not interfere with each other on a basin level. And I'll show you this little graph here, which kind of illustrates how the tool is used. On the left side, you can see a hypothetical basin, which has conservation areas that are very important. And on the right are areas where dams could be built. But what this does is that it interferes with these priority conservation areas and can highly impact the environment and the species there. And that's not good. And you see this existing dam, but it won't be good for the basin. It'll interfere and disrupt a lot of the environmental flows there. So yes, like I said, this is the areas of conflict, and we want to avoid these conservation areas. So when a project does its environmental impact assessment, for example, it might be approved only because of the project has in those surrounding areas has low impact, but it might have a huge effect in the rest of the basin if it interferes with other projects. Or a developer might miss an opportunity to build a bigger project that has more energy and instead builds small dams that can affect the basin at a larger scale. So instead of building the dams in these conservation areas, it can build dams along the areas that are not necessarily high impact and avoid these conservation areas and creating better flows and better energy outputs. So here at this graph in the analysis, it takes cumulative impacts at a fragmentation level, energy output, hydropower capacity, and river fragmentation. And it looks at the best case scenarios and it eliminates the least effective options. The little red dot there at about 60% will reduce fragmentation at about 3,000 kilometers. But this graph doesn't show you the wide range of options and metrics that you could actually analyze. So here are just some examples of the metrics that we used in Myanmar with the University of Manchester. Navigation and flood control. And some of these metrics are to minimize or to maximize. We want to meet the demands and the interests of all the ministries of a country and the other stakeholders that might have something to say during these developments. So something that we did in the Irrawaddy River was look at a combination of dams and found some not so good solutions, but some of the win-win solutions. In the red dots, it's the Pareto optimum. And you can see there the percent of hydropower where the win-win solution is about 70%. And on the y-axis, the kilometer of river impacted for migratory fish is about 4,500 to 5,000. Instead of having your full hydropower potential all the way up to the river being affected to 6,000. So you find a compromise of these existing dams these hypothetical dams to the capacity and compare them and weigh them against what the effects would be for migratory fish. And this is the Irrawaddy River, which is quite big. But some of the trade-offs that we did in the Mekong Basin, which means Little River, it's a tributary of the Irrawaddy Basin. So we took some of those metrics, and they're a little hard to visualize. So you can do them, twice, and then add on 1 or 2 metrics, or even 3. Migratory fish with navigation, or hydropower capacity with migratory fish, or fishery support. And this graph, this is a very simplified explanation of the full analysis. But by taking these metrics, you can look at the best option, including for this one, cost. So the best option here for hydropower generation and fishery support at the lowest cost would be option D. So in another analysis, it could be probably another one of these dots that has low hydropower but high fishery support. But when you take the analysis through with all the metrics, you can look at the best option for development at a reasonable cost. So some of the challenges and opportunities is that you could have the benefit of this approach is that by doing these analyses at an early stage, you can weigh out your options and begin this process earlier and not just at a project-to-project basis. So you have a set of investment choices in front of you, and the government is able to make the best decisions for the basin and for the country, for the environment and its people by using these approaches. And we have a preliminary assessment of our repowering initiative. looking not just at hydropower, but the potential of other renewable energies for countries. So not just hydropower, but how does hydropower fit within a renewable energy mix? Not as the priority energy, but how it can fit within solar and wind and others. This is in the Balkan area. The former Yugoslavia has a lot of renewable energy potential, but not just for hydro. So how can renewable energy meet the demands of the people, meet the demands of the countries? And these are just preliminary, so I won't go into too much detail here. So thank you so much, everyone.
So you can see that the hydropower by design approach has been applied in Southeast Asia, not in the Mekong yet. But if we use some of those proxies of 60% or 50% or something that Laos believes through an assessment of the actual generation capacity that can come from the region, you could set that target for generation and then find the optimal points of navigation passage or fish passage and come out with the best solution. Mm-hmm. So to have a group like Hydropower by Design do a study in Laos requires funding, requires some attention and connections, and we're working on those connections now. But I think this is a way forward, and it's a step in the right direction towards that system scale energy planning that Laos needs to consider. We have a lot of signals coming out of Laos that it's beginning to think about this as a strategic choice, and can talk more about that during the discussion session. But I'd like to end our panel portion and turn it over to all of you for questions. We've got about 20 minutes left for questions. Thank you. And we have microphones. If you could introduce yourself. Up here, Gabby.
This is the question for Anna Marie. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Yoel Kirshner. I'm with USAID. You mentioned that the cost of planning using the tool would increase the cost of the total project. So maybe if you wouldn't mind going into that. And sure. I was also wondering if the cost would increase the total project cost. Does the tool also include the value of the fisheries being lost, or the potential value of saving them, or the agricultural values, and also the let's say non-timber forest products and carbon values, or sure. Flooded areas, because they could potentially be factored back into that and come into savings.
Sure. So to your first point, it would increase the cost of the project from 5 to 10%. But the benefits in the long run are far greater than the costs, because you're bringing in a lot more of these metrics and these elements. So the costs would increase only by 5 to 10%. But in the benefits in the long run, you have better fishery support, you have better navigation, which is better for the future outcomes of the country. And the tool does have potential to include all these other elements like carbon and agriculture, but it really depends on the analysis that is being done for the country and what each of the ministries and actors and stakeholders want for that particular analysis.
We also have other members of the yes. Hydropower by Design team, and if you wish to contribute, please go ahead.
Sorry, do you want to? Sure, I'll just add one thing quickly. So just something to
Amy, could you identify yourself?
Oh, hi. I'm Amy Newsack. I'm the Assistant Director of our Saving Great Rivers program based here in Arlington, Virginia. Something just to mention on the additional cost. And Anna-Maria, you've been deeply involved in this more than I have, I think, but looking at influencing the flow of finance in order to pay for that increase of cost. We're working with the Inter-American Development Bank right now in Mexico and creating a facility where a country like Mexico would express demand and interest to actually go through a hydropower by design approach. The Inter-American Development Bank would then provide a grant to do that extra exercise to make sure that the planning is done at this more stringent level. And then that fund would actually be a revolving fund. So royalties generated from the projects that are developed more sustainably in Mexico would go back to the fund to pay for additional project planning at that more sustainable level. And so that's something we're exploring right now, talking with institutes in Asia as well about potentially having that investment facility there as well.
Thank you, Amy. And it's called an early planning facility, which is really important. But that does kind of answer your question to the increase of costs and how to meet that challenge.
Yeah, and just to follow up, my name is Scott Bartos. I'm also with USAID. And again, this is a really interesting approach to considering energy generation. Digging a little bit more deeply, I was curious in that analysis, do you have like an economist that's trying to assign monetary value to the fisheries, to the navigation, abilities on these waterways? Is that what's behind some of the scale you're presenting there? Are there actual dollar figures assigned into that model?
I don't think so. I gave a very simplified explanation of the analysis. There's various scatter plots and graphs that it would have taken me probably 40 minutes to explain, but monetary values I don't think have actually been done for the analysis. It's more of the actual impact of kilometers, for example, of a river basin or the fishery support, but wealth accounting for them hasn't been a part of the tool.
Yeah, we're exploring it in the evolution of the hydropower by design approach. This is just the latest evolution of it. And so having and putting a value on ecosystem services is certainly more advanced, and I think a challenge across the board that people are trying to address. And so we, at this moment, don't have an economist in our team to do that, but I think that's a critical next step in the evolution of the tool.
And I think we can see ways in which the approach can be built out. And for Laos particularly, the government of Laos is interested in the bottom line on this. And they want to know, it doesn't matter how much power comes out of the basin. It doesn't matter if it's hydropower or solar or whatever. It's the money coming in at the end of the day that will help finance its future. So building costs is a step in the right direction.
Okay. Thank you for your question.
So I'm Nick from Voice of America Customer Service, and as Courtney has mentioned, Cambodia has the highest rate of its electoral powers because it doesn't want to depend on its neighboring country. So by comparing the pros and cons, and they want to avoid environmental impact or the livelihood of the people around, do you think Cambodia will be better off to purchase the power from Laos? And if not, to what extent do you think it will affect the general election in 2018?
Good question.
Yeah, it's a good question. Like I mentioned, many of the people we talked to were very concerned about energy security, but at the same time, Cambodia is also going to be one of the countries most deeply impacted by the projects in Laos, primarily because of the fisheries. Protein in Cambodia is largely dependent on wild catch fisheries. There have been some efforts to do reservoir raising fisheries, but that doesn't provide the same variety of protein and other nutrients from fish that you'd find in the wild catch. So one of the reasons that we would suggest that Cambodia and Vietnam both consider power purchase agreements with Laos is that gives them some leverage over mitigation efforts. That they could say, we're interested in purchasing power, but we're interested in purchasing power from projects that have better mitigation impacts, that are sited in places that will have less impact than some of the current sites would potentially have by blocking off migration access for spawning fish species. And in Cambodia in particular, because you mentioned, it pays such a high rate, around, I think, almost the same as 20 cents per kilowatt hour now, is about the same as what Singapore pays. The level of development in both those countries is different. Cambodia could significantly benefit from building domestic power that could go into a grid, but if it has enough connections with Thailand, Vietnam, and Laos, then there is the opportunity for flexibility. So there would still be some dependency, but it wouldn't be dependent just on one country. There can be better regional trading, and that's one of the big benefits of the power grid in Laos. And going back to the mitigation effort, that's particularly useful for Cambodia because two of the largest projects in Cambodia, the Stung Treng and Sambor Rapids dams, which would be the two on the mainstream, would actually be some of the worst for fisheries throughout the Mekong Basin because they're so far down, and they're close to the Tonle Sap, which is sort of, if you will, the beating heart of the Mekong, and one of the best areas for fisheries spawning that contributes to fish throughout the region because of the migration patterns. So if Cambodia were, for instance, to consider not building Stung Treng or Sambor Rapids, then although it would be buying power from other countries, that would probably be a good trade-off due to the concerns over protein, the lost value from the fisheries, which, as we mentioned, the Mekong, and much of this is in Cambodia, and particularly the Mekong is one of the most productive inland fisheries in the world. So if you're just looking at power, it might not necessarily make sense for Cambodia to purchase electricity. But if you're taking the broader systems view and looking at the externalities that are not usually taken into account when you're discussing hydropower projects, then it would make a much better argument for purchasing power abroad. As far as the 2018 elections, we haven't really discussed the energy purchasing impact on the 2018 elections, but I can just comment that, as we discussed before, part of the momentum for improving Cambodia's environmental laws stemmed from the 2013 elections, where the ruling party took significant loss at the polls, and that was linked to a variety of different issues, but land grabbing and then unsustainable development resulting from that land grabbing and concerns over corruption are all intertwined, and that was one of the primary reasons. So if, for instance, the environmental code is pushed out in 2017, if it's seen to be effective, if there are a number of projects that are suspended or taken off of the table because they're viewed as environmentally unsustainable, if people see that these laws are effective and that they are being implemented, then that could potentially have a positive push towards the ruling party in the upcoming election. On the other hand, I think oftentimes the opposition parties are still kind of seen as the champions for environment. So a lot's going to really depend on how effective these laws are. I mean, we've spoken to some of the people that are drafting them. They're very much passionate about what they're doing. They want these laws to succeed, but as with anything, any change takes time, and even if you have good laws on the books, implementation is always a challenge, particularly in countries like Cambodia, where you still have a lot of corruption that can cause problems with the implementation of these projects. So I would just say that that's kind of the one factor that we would really be watching for the 2018 election.
Yeah, I could just add into that. Cambodian National Rescue Party opposition leaders have said that they're anti-dam and they're all for the protection of environmental resources. But that's kind of just an opposition party statement. If they were to gain power, they still have to deal with the energy futures of the country. We're seeing that, or we're seeing more signals that Cambodia's ruling party is weighing its options for energy development, much more so than, say, Laos. And one of the reasons is that it hasn't embarked on this project-by-project approach, this sales approach that gets the country deep into being unable to extract itself from a process. But at the same time, the Lower Say Son 2 Dam, which is near the confluence of the Say Son and the Srei Pak rivers in Cambodia, has been mandated by Hun Sen to the Chinese developer to get that thing finished before the election in 2018. So power can be rolling, and I can demonstrate that there's cheap power coming in, and this is a successful project. Other questions?
Good morning. My name is Tony from Vietnam News Agency. 2 days ago, Mr. Assistant Secretary Daniel Russell has a remark in CNS about the Asia architecture. In his remark, he said that the United States government continue to focus on some initiatives like Lower Mekong Initiative. And I'd like to ask panel 2 questions. First question about could you talk about something about the progress of the LMI?
Sure.
And if there is specific project or plans regarding LMI that carried out recently? And second question is that the United States spend any budget of LMI to decrease some emissions in some lower countries like Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia? Thank you.
Great questions. And this is kind of the ending portion of our publication to talk about U.S. engagement in Laos currently. And so about a year ago, decision makers over dams realized that they have this challenge of being unable to optimize the power resources within the basin. And they went right to the United States government, to the U.S. Embassy, requesting assistance in optimization and other issues. One of those issues is kind of helping Laos turn around its image as a hydropower developer in Southeast Asia to more to the sustainable side, which the U.S. can assist with. But there have been a series of engagements coming from the Lower Mekong Initiative, coming from the Smart Infrastructure for the Mekong program, coming from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and that engagement is deepening and sustaining. Next week, Courtney will attend a training by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to the Ministry of Energy and Mines and other officials on public participation methods, and this is the second part of an ongoing process. We think this is a good approach. The two of us attended the first one, and it's interesting to see that the government is actually looking at ways to better engage with those that are affected by dams, as well as think about how to mitigate and assist those that are resettled during the resettlement process. However, it's a 2-year program that happens twice a year. You have resources coming from the United States and landing in Vientiane and carrying out the training procedures. We think that more needs to happen, and there are signals that more is happening. The U.S. is opening a new USAID office in Laos. It's the first time that there will be a USAID director in Laos since 1975, and the director will be landing later this month to begin her tenure there. And there will be 9 others in that office. I'm not sure of the budget or the programming directions, but there's interest that USAID is also interested in energy and water management issues. So this is growing, and this is part of a process that can help Laos make the turn towards a system-scale energy plan. We hope that the U.S. is also able to convene the right actors, whether it's from Australia, from Korea, from Japan, from the EU, and maybe even China, and bring China into the conversation to have a more, I guess, a quicker turn towards that system-scale planning, because the timeline is running out. Essentially, 2020, you've got 30% of the dams built, 70% remaining. There's still an option there to take a new course. So I think what happens over the next 5 years will be the most significant in terms of the future for the Mekong. Other questions? Comments? Amy?
So we talked a little bit about valuing resources, but 2 other things that I think are critical in this is governance at this regional level, and then also data. So the paucity of data is well known, and so wanting to know if you have comments on that and ways to incentivize countries to invest more in looking for and acquiring the necessary data to make more informed decisions. But also, what's the role of the MRC in all of this? And as it's starting to, its responsibilities and its authority in the region is progressing a bit, is there reform for MRC to strengthen its governance in this kind of an approach, or is there potential for another actor to provide that level of governance?
I'll comment briefly on the Mekong River Commission. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it was created in 1995 with the Mekong Agreement, and is essentially meant to be a water management organization in the region. All of the 4 main lower Mekong states are all members. Myanmar and China are observers, but never officially joined the organization. And when it was created, it did have limitations specifically placed on it because countries were concerned over sovereignty. They didn't want to give up too much power to the MRC. So it's largely a convening body. And in the past, it has performed useful regional technical analysis. It put out a strategic environmental assessment in, I believe, 2010. They're working currently on a council study. The main challenge is that it has not been as effective as people had hoped it would be. There have really only been 2 tests of the Mekong River Commission's ability to coordinate and negotiate on projects, and in both cases, the Sheaburi and the Don Sahang project, it went through negotiations, it went through a technical assessment, and was eventually kicked up to the diplomatic level because there was just no way that they could find a consensus within the organization. And the rules were written as such so that Laos could come out saying, we went through the review process, we're going to move ahead with the projects. We don't need consensus because it's our sovereign project. So that's the main limitation on the MRC. Moving forward, the MRC is going through a bit of a reorganization right now. Their funding's been cut pretty significantly, and they're reducing their number of staff from 200 down to around 70. So there are concerns here about what kind of a role the MRC is going to be able to play in the future. Our thought at Stimson has been that the technical reviews that they did during that review process were impactful, not as impactful as some civil society groups might have liked, but you could see direct recommendations taken from those technical reviews that were then implemented on the Sheaburi and the Don Sahang project. So we think that that's an important role for the MRC to continue to play, and one that it should be able to do even with reduced staff, because that's something that's done when projects are brought up for discussion. They do the technical review. The big challenge here is more about the data that the MRC houses, because before there was the Mekong River Commission, there is the Mekong Committee, and there's been data collected from all of the countries in the region for decades, and all of that is housed at the MRC. So as it's going through its downsizing process, it's unclear to what extent how quickly all of that's going to come back online. Currently, it's not available online right now. It's mostly on backups on individual computers. They don't have it all collected anywhere. There's a lot of data that's still raw and hasn't been coordinated. So one of the biggest areas that we think the MRC could potentially play, and that we need assistance to do this, both technical assistance and funding, would be to really finish the backlog of data that they've collected, get it all collected, get it online somewhere so that it's more easily available to people who are interested in purchasing it. Currently, you can purchase it, but it's usually a long process because it goes through finding the data on someone's computer and then getting back to you, and then going through the raw data and turning that into something that can be usable. That's a role that we think the MRC could continue to play, and it would be a valuable role for the region just because there is no other database of data. As Amy is pointing out, there's a paucity of data on water flows, on fisheries, and that's been improving significantly in recent years as there's been a lot of academic study on these issues, but there's no good one collection of data except for the MRC. So moving forward, even as it is downsizing, those are the 2 roles that we've identified that we think are probably the most important.
Right.
Brian has any additional comments on that? I mean, the other one comment that I might make is that as far as other organizations coming in and playing a role, I mean, the LMI may be able to do some of the capacity building on those issues, but there is a China Lansong Mekong cooperative mechanism, and that was just announced last year. They've had their first meetings, and they have announced that they're going to be moving forward with a water resources center based in Kunming. So there is the potential that that could be a backup of some sort for providing analysis or storing data. Now, of course, the challenge with that is that China is not known for being free and open with its data sharing, particularly not on hydrology issues. But that is one potential alternative is if the MRC is not able to play the same role that it has in the past. Some of that may be shifting to China. The resources center is not set up yet, and our concern would again be of data transparency and availability to people who are interested in it. But that's one potential option moving forward, is that if there needs to be somewhere to store and maintain the data, then China has more capacity to do that.
So to conclude, we've run out of time. The central argument of our publication is it's not too late to shift course. And the external community, the U.S. government, the donor banks can provide the guidance and the support to help Laos move in this direction. Government-to-government assistance probably isn't enough. We need organizations like the Nature Conservancy and other methodologies to be plugged into the system to help that transition happen more quickly. But the next 5 years, I think, are the most critical time. And I hope that one of the takeaways from this event is that we can all begin to look at the Mekong as a basin and not just a river. And it's not just about those 11 mainstream dams in Laos and Cambodia. We need to consider the broader plans, which are more than 100 dams for the entire basin, and also the broader potentials that could come out of this landscape. One last point is that Courtney and I are blasting off for the region tomorrow. We'll be on a plane at this time tomorrow for a 1-month trip. We're going to hold 2 launches of our publication in the region, attend several conferences, and you can follow our progress on our Facebook page. We'll be posting pictures and insights that we gather on our trip. Thanks for coming out.